Welcome to Moment of Truth with Amy Chen Mills. That's me. Today is Transgender Day of Remembrance, and on my own social justice calendar, also Trans Day of Resilience. As I speak, there are people gathering here in Santa Cruz, California at the Resource Center for Nonviolence, and others gathering all over this country and the world to remember those who have been harmed and even killed for simply being who they are. If you have been paying any attention at all, you already know that trans human rights, along with all LGBTQ plus human rights across the United States, have been on the chopping block for Republicans in red states and everywhere. In our own quote-unquote progressive community here in the California Monterey Bay Area, we have seen the incursion of Moms for Liberty at a public recruitment meeting in Watsonville, and at least one Santa Cruz area parent on Instagram attempting to remove pride flags in classrooms at New Brighton Middle School in Capitola and to ban trans girls from junior lifeguards competitions. This with support from local people if likes and comments on his posts are considered support. If you've been following this show or following me on my Talk of the Bay programs or on social media, you know we have been tracking this lunacy for some time and that it is now showing up in hot spots across even the San Francisco Bay Area and Silicon Valley. It doesn't take an advanced degree to recognize scapegoating, religious bigotry, and tremendous cruelty when it shows up. And the movement to restrict the freedoms of trans people, to target one of the most vulnerable populations in our nation, is for me a clear indicator of the Christo-fascist threat that the current GOP, Trump, and people like Ron DeSantis, and so many others in the Republican Party now represent. Today, we have a very special and stellar lineup of national-level trans rights activists for our Trans Day of Remembrance and Resilience show today, Monday, November 20th. Our title, Rock Stars for Trans Rights. So let's get right to our rock stars who should all be online or on the phone with us. I'm going to start with Kristen Browde. Kristen, can you hear me?
I sure can.
Okay, Kristen, I'm going to introduce you first, and we're going to wait for Erin to join us. Maybe she dropped off of Clean Feed. Browde is a transgender lawyer whose practice is in New York. At age 73, Browde is being followed by more than 415,000 people on TikTok, where she goes by Kristen B. She is vice president of the Florida Democratic Party's LGBTQ plus caucus and lives in downtown Miami, Florida. Kristen comes from the world of journalism, where she was a multiple Emmy-winning journalist who spent 17 years as a correspondent and anchor at CBS News. During that time, she also attended law school, founded her own law firm, became a pension fund trustee, and had 2 children. Kristen, that's amazing. Kristen worked for the Clinton campaign, and in the effort to overturn North Carolina's infamous bathroom bill, became the first transgender person in New York State to run for office with the endorsement of a major political party. For the past 17 years, Kristen has served as a trustee also for the AFTRA Pension Fund, a $3 billion fund covering members of SAG-AFTRA, where she is a member of the fund's investment and administrative committees. Welcome, Kristen.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us all the way from the East Coast, where it's 9:05 p.m., I believe.
It is, and I've just come back from our Trans Day of Remembrance and Resilience ceremonies here in Miami.
Yeah, I had a feeling some of you would be doing that during the day. And Kristen has about, I think, 400,000 TikTok followers on her TikTok channel. I introduced her as someone who has a long history of working with the Democratic Party, was nominated to run for office. And I think, Kristen, what's most impressed me with your work is that you are in Florida, where the atmosphere for LGBTQ plus individuals has been pretty hostile. And I'm just wondering how it feels just for you personally being in Florida, and if you have any thoughts on your heart that you would like to share on Trans Day of Remembrance and Resilience just to get started.
Well, look, this is probably our most solemn day of the year, where we remember those who've been lost to the senseless violence that's been whipped up by people like our governor I'm not going to be polite about him, and his puppet legislature, who have transformed this state into a place that is indeed quite hostile to anybody LGBTQ+, but in particular to anyone transgender. And it's unfortunate, it's unnecessary, it's pretty stupid, particularly when you look at the reasons they cite for coming after us. You've heard them accuse, if you've been paying attention, you've heard them accuse us of being pedophiles, of being groomers, of all sorts of things like that. But the fact of the matter is, there have been about, I actually, one of the things I do on TikTok, and I think it's really what generated me to get so many followers, is that every week I do a report on who's made the news for sex crimes involving children. And I've been tracking them since February. And in that time period, I've tracked 4,697 different people in the United States who've made the news for actual crimes against children. I'm not talking about stings. I'm not talking about child sex abuse materials. I'm talking about actually harming kids. 4,697. And you hear first it's drag queens, and then you hear it's trans people. Well, of those 406,097, not a single one has been a drag queen. And exactly 3, slightly under 0.07% have been transgender. The biggest single grouping has been people who work in what I call the religion industry. And 291 of them have been ordained members of the clergy. Here in Florida, we've had almost 300 in this state since February. Not one a drag queen, not one trans, but 16 have been actual ordained members of clergy. So you got to wonder what it is that has these right-wing folks going after us when it seems like they're the ones committing the crimes.
Yeah. Yeah. And you've also been talking about a Moms for Liberty, I think a member of Moms for Liberty. You were just posting about this, and your posts are amazing because
chapter president.
The Philadelphia chapter president. Could you talk about that person and what's happening with that Moms for Liberty chapter?
Well, in Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Inquirer just today had an article, and a lot of us started really paying attention to Moms for Liberty when they started taking over school boards, and then they quoted Adolf Hitler on their website in Indiana.
Yeah.
And then they doubled down, and their president said, yeah, that's not bad. Well, here in Philadelphia, or not here in Philadelphia because I'm not in Philadelphia, but in Philadelphia, the Inquirer, which is the biggest paper there, found that the Republican ward leader and pastor, that's who this guy is, who is the president of what they call the Liberty chapter, that's the Philadelphia chapter, is a registered sex offender. And the Republican, not just a sex offender. This guy comes from, if you're an old timer like me, you'll remember a guy named Lyndon LaRouche, who was a right-wing / left-wing, depending on what day you caught him, conspiracy freak. And he ran the gamut from extreme right anti-Semitic to Marxist socialist, depending on which year you caught him. But this guy came out of the Lyndon LaRouche organization, and his name was Philip Fisher Jr., and the Republicans discovered this when they saw the paper this morning, and they quickly got rid of him. They said, no, you're out as our ward leader in Philadelphia. But Moms for Liberty hasn't done a thing about him. And if the paper went and asked Fisher, what's up with this, And he's a pastor at a place called the Center for Universal Divinity. And he told the paper that his conviction was a railroad job, even though he had pleaded guilty to abusing a 14-year-old boy. So that's Moms for Liberty.
Yeah, it feels like a lot of projection. Sorry, go ahead and finish.
No, that's fine. I mean, these people are going after us when it seems that it is them and their leaders who are committing the crimes. It's not about protecting children for them. It's about imposing what's their religious view on everybody else.
I call it Christofascism. I think there's a real case to be had. I think it's actually being spoken pretty clearly by members of the Republican Party. It looks like we have Aaron and maybe back online with us. Aaron, can you hear us?
Yes. Hi, how's it going?
Good. Sorry for the little blip there. I'm just going to introduce you. Erin Reed, her pronouns are she and her, is a transgender journalist and activist based in Washington, D.C. She tracks LGBTQ plus legislation around the United States for her subscription newsletter, Erin in the Morning, on Substack. That newsletter has 44,000 subscribers. Her work has been featured in the AP, Reuters, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and many more major media outlets. You can follow her on Twitter and TikTok, where she has 427,000 followers. Her website is Erin Reed Writes, and that's Erin with an E-R-I-N. Erin is also partner to Zoe Zephyr, the transgender representative in Montana, who was removed from legislative chambers when she told her colleagues that they had blood on their hands from passing anti-gender affirming care legislation. Welcome, Erin.
Thank you so much for having me. That was a wonderful introduction. I'm just here to talk about any of it with you.
Okay, thank you so much. And let me make sure Maybe's on the line with us. Maybe, are you there?
Present.
Present and accounted for. This is your second time on the show, and I am so pleased to have you again. Maybe Pudlow, also known as Maybe a Girl, is a 3-time transgender congressional candidate running in California's 30th district, which includes Los Angeles, West Hollywood, Burbank, and Glendale. She is running on an intersectional humanitarian platform that includes universal health care, housing for all, education for all, environmental justice, racial justice, LGBTQIA rights, and reproductive rights. If elected to Congress, she would be the first transgender person federally elected to Congress in U.S. history. Maybe made history in 2022 when she became the first non-binary person to ever advance to a general election for U.S. Congress. She ended up with more than 60,000 votes, despite being outspent more than 500 to 1 by the 2022-year incumbent. Maybe is also the first drag queen to ever be elected to any public office in the U.S., serving on the Silver Lake Neighborhood Council in Los Angeles as treasurer and at-large representative since 2019. Welcome, Maybe.
Thank you so much, Amy. I'm super excited to be back.
Yeah, go ahead.
Great company.
Yeah, I'm excited to have all of you. I call you the rock stars because you're so inspirational at a time of what's, really kind of a dark time for transgender human rights, at least in the United States and actually elsewhere around the world. I'm going to get back to Erin Reed with her Erin in the Morning Substack newsletter from today, because it is Trans Day of Remembrance and Resilience. And Erin, you talked about a few people that you sort of wanted to describe and flesh out more fully as human beings who were killed because they were transgender. Brianna Gay, a young British trans girl who had been heavily bullied, who was murdered on her walk back from a local park. Eden Knight, who successfully escaped brutal oppression in Saudi Arabia by fleeing to the United States, only to be trafficked back there, leading to her suicide. Ariana Mitchell, a trans girl who was gunned down at a party after she was asked about her gender identity. So I did this with Kristen Browde, and Erin, I wanted to give you and maybe the chance to share more about what is on your heart on this Trans Day of Remembrance and Resilience.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for sharing their names. These are 3 stories that made a profound impact on me. As a journalist, I often have to cover some very difficult topics whenever it comes to trans people. And I can say that every single trans person out there, we all know people whose lives were either taken or lost because of their gender identity. One of the names that I think really sticks out to me of the ones that you just mentioned was Eden Knight, who I was able to work really hard on that story. All of her friends on Twitter at the time had jumped on and said that nobody was covering it. She was living here in the United States. She was able to be herself. She accessed gender-affirming care. And because her father was unfortunately a wealthy businessman in Saudi Arabia, he had hired fixers in the United States to traffic her back to Saudi Arabia, which was successfully done. And that's where she was forced to detransition. And she took her own life. And her story, whenever you see videos, whenever you see her writing, whenever you see her pictures, it was a very beautiful story. She was filled with happiness, and it's people like her that I carry in my heart whenever I report and do this work.
Yeah. And maybe I wanted to give you a chance as well. Maybe a girl running for Congress. If she wins, she would be the first transgender person elected federally to the U.S. Congress. Maybe, is there anything on your heart that you would like to share on this Trans Day of Remembrance and Resilience, which is an ad that I like, actually?
Absolutely. And I do like that ad as well. And, Trans Day of Remembrance precedes Trans Awareness Week. And, on this day, we mourn and honor the countless transgender victims of violence, murder, and suicide. And this is not just random. This is all culturally enforced. And I think that the culture that we live in right now, unfortunately, is not helping, especially considering that this was the worst year in modern history for anti-LGBTQIA legislation, with most of those bills specifically targeting trans people, over 500 anti-trans bills. It really compounds the urgency for trans rights and solidarity with trans people.
Yeah. This would be a good time, I think, to mention the Human Rights Campaign report, taking statistics from the FBI reports on annual crime statistics showing that anti-LGBTQ plus hate crimes were sharply up from the prior year of 2021, with a 13.8% increase in reports based on sexual orientation and a shocking 32.9%, that's almost 33%, almost a third jump in reported hate crimes based on gender identity. And I just want to read this quote that you all might want to comment on from the president of the Human Rights Campaign, Kelly Robinson, who released a statement. The constant stream of hostile rhetoric from fringe anti-equality figures alongside the relentless passage of discriminatory bills, particularly those targeting transgender individuals in state legislatures, created an environment where it was sadly foreseeable that individuals with violent tendencies might respond to this rhetoric. That has seemed clear to me for some time. And going to you, Aaron, you have a partner, I believe, unless that situation has changed, who is serving in the Montana state legislature. And I'm wondering, you're tracking legislation across the country, both the bad news and the good news, and also how voters actually really feel. But when you hear these statistics and you hear this quote, what comes up for you? And is that what you're still seeing? Is there a trend increasing with this kind of legislation? Is the trend increasing or is it decreasing? Do you see any hope?
So I do want to first start off, before we even get to all of that yes, I do see hope. Hope is always there. Hope is something that we carry within us to do this work. And I think that the joy that we as a community share with one another is what gives us the fuel. Now, in terms of what I'm seeing, yes, the legislation, the onslaught that's been so just oppressive has led to people, taking actions against LGBTQ people, against pride events. I've seen in Idaho where there were members of the Patriot Front that were all pulled out of the back of a U-Haul last year because they were on their way to a Pride festival. They had shields and weapons and such. We see those things, and that's not divorced from the fact that that very year, Idaho attempted to pass a ban on gender affirming care for trans youth that would put the parents in jail for life.
Yeah.
We see this all across the United States. And we also see in Tennessee, district attorneys right now outlawing pride events, making it so that you cannot show public homosexuality. It's we've seen this. These are actual laws that have been on the books that I was able to report on.
Yeah, this was was this in Tennessee? Because this is an important one. This is banning public homosexuality, quote unquote. Can you what is that? I mean, what is that supposed to look like?
So during Pride, on June 15th, a Tennessee town by the name of Murfreesboro, Tennessee, they passed a obscenity law that used the definitions in Murfreesboro Code. And the definitions in Murfreesboro Code for sexual conduct basically said homosexuality is indecent. And so they used that law that they passed in June to attempt to stop borough pride from happening in Murfreesboro in Tennessee. That thankfully failed because the ACLU of Tennessee sued them. But that law was in effect up until November 17th. We made a big stink about it. And I think even, the governor of California tweeted about it. Gavin Newsom had brought up the issue. And thankfully, homosexuality is now removed from Murfreesboro Code. But they are still using the same provisions to target library books, to pull LGBTQ books off of shelves.
Yeah.
And so, this is a major issue.
And a lot of their rhetoric around this is that this promotes sexual depravity and child sexual abuse and on and on. I've seen just the most horrific, sort of propaganda. And this is what Kristen Browde in Florida has been tracking. And she was just talking about statistics. I don't know if you all were able to hear this. Kristen, you were talking about the number one industry, you call it an industry, for where child sex abuse happens is, and I'm going to let you say it.
It's the religion industry. And let me just say what a huge fan of Erin I am.
Yeah. Yeah, we're all huge fans.
I follow Erin on TikTok. She rocks.
She does rock.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, you all are rock stars. But then when you also track drag queens and transgender people, they're like so far 0 drag queens, and this is what they're trying to shut down is drag shows and have shut down in some states, and maybe a few transgender people, but the percentage is just so minimal as to be almost negligible in terms of significance.
0.07% when transgender people are 1.5% of the population. So figure it out. It is nuts.
Yeah. Erin, you were going to say something.
Yeah. So, what I was going to say, you mentioned Florida, and Florida, thankfully, just recently had the lawsuit over the drag ban in Hamburger Mary's. And Hamburger Mary's, a local drag brunch venue, prevailed. And that went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court kicked it back. They said, no, Florida, you can't enforce this law right now. And so, we are seeing victories. And that's something that you asked earlier about hope. And that there is hope. We see victories in courts. We see it in the Supreme Court with drag ban. And just now in the last elections, we saw around the United States school boards that were basically anti-trans and anti-LGBTQ, Moms for Liberty types. They failed in 70% of their races this last cycle.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I mean, that's really important. And we had them come here to our county, Santa Cruz County, California, and there was an immediate response by activists in this community, and we're waiting to see sort of what is their next move, if any. But they're in San Mateo County, Santa Clara County. This is the San Francisco Bay Area, and hopefully they won't succeed. But it's interesting how bold they feel to come into a very deep blue area and try to set up these Moms for Liberty anti-LGBTQ plus groups. And Maybe knows all about this because maybe a girl running for Congress for Adam Schiff's seat down in Southern California, you have been dealing with people coming to the schools, Proud Boys in Glendale. Mm-hmm. I mean, so could you talk about what is going on now down there and how does it feel compared to, I think we spoke a few months ago?
Absolutely. I think when we think about and we hear about all of these anti-trans bills and all of this anti-LGBTQIA hate across the nation, I think we often affiliate it with red states. And, I live in California, which is a super blue state. It's considered to be, in many regards, a safe haven for LGBTQIA people, but it's happening here as well. And we actually have had anti-trans bills introduced here in California this year. There was a bill known as AB 1314, which was introduced by a state rep, Rep. Asalee. And essentially what this bill sought to do is it sought to out trans people, to out trans students to their families. Essentially, it would have required school districts to notify parents or guardians within 3 days if a student came out to their peers or a teacher or a counselor. And, the argument that that the people who support this bill have is that, we need parental rights. And one has to consider if a queer student feels more comfortable coming out to their school than their family, then there's probably a reason for that. And I think a lot of people overlook the fact that abuse, particularly abuse against queer peoples, often happens within the home. And so even though this bill failed, unfortunately, what we have seen in Southern California is that various school districts have been trying to essentially take that language and adopt that same model within the school district. So even though it wasn't passed on a state level, school districts are wanting to use that language to still create that circumstance where if a student comes out, they have to notify parents or guardians within 3 days. We've seen this in Temecula. We've seen this in other parts of SoCal. The fortunate thing is that California courts are saying you can't do this, but they're still trying. And so we're seeing these groups of people come and protest LGBTQIA inclusion in schools. So as somebody who grew up and went to high school in the early 2000s, I remember not hearing or seeing anything about anything LGBTQIA. And I remember how it made me feel. It made me feel very othered. And in trying to include LGBTQIA folks in schools, we just want kids to know that it's okay if you are LGBTQIA, it's okay if you're not. Nobody is trying to groom kids to become LGBTQIA. We want kids to know, though, that you should have a safe space in your own school. And so we're seeing this right here in the center of LA County, Glendale, which Glendale is just about a 5-minute drive from where I live. And this group of parents, they call themselves Leave Our Kids Alone. The acronym is LOCA, which is fitting in many regards. And essentially, they've been showing up and storming these school board meetings, claiming that because they're parents, they should have a right to say that, no, we don't want to see pride flags in school. We don't want to have any sort of LGBTQIA education or whatnot. And the thing is, these school districts are not doing anything outside of the law. In fact, they are complying with California state laws requiring LGBTQIA education in their school curriculum. I went to the school board meeting this past June, and it was remarkable how many of these quote unquote parents showed up to protest. And all that the school board was doing that month was recognizing June as Pride Month in the Glendale Unified School District, something that is already recognized on a county level, a state level, a federal level. And yet you have this group of very vocal, and I will say it's a small but very vocal group of people. And they are using children as pawns to express their hate for the LGBTQIA community. Yeah. And it's really unfortunate. I mean, the Proud Boys were marching in Glendale, 5 minutes away from where I live. So again, the point is that we think of this happening in red states, but it's also very much happening in states like California.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about what we actually think the true motivations are of this attack on LGBTQ plus rights across the country. We need to go to a very quick break. Welcome back to Moment of Truth with Amy Chen Mills. That's me. Today is Trans Day of Remembrance and Resilience, and our show today is Rock Stars for Trans Rights. We have the most amazing guests, maybe a girl running for Congress in California District 30, Adam Schiff's district. We also have Erin Reed of the Erin in the Morning Substack. She is like famous in the LGBTQ plus community. Folks, if you don't know her, you need to subscribe to her Substack, Erin in the Morning, and find her on social media. Also, Kristen B, she goes by, that's her handle on TikTok, where she has 400,000 plus followers, a transgender attorney with an amazing background and experience in the Democratic Party, running for office, and also standing up for trans rights, based in Miami, Florida, of all places. Now, I have to go to some quick local news, which I think relates to all of this. Protesters at the California Democratic Convention on Saturday, November 18th, disrupted proceedings and speeches to be given by Adam Schiff and Katie Porter. Protesters were calling for a ceasefire in the Israel-Gaza conflict. According to AP News reports, it looks as though some of our local elected officials were part of the protest, or at least were holding signs. And local California Assemblymember Gail Pellerin later, she was not at the protest, released a statement from the Legislative Jewish Caucus calling the protest completely unacceptable due to chants from protesters that could be interpreted as supporting the end of the State of Israel and justification for the October 7th Hamas attacks on Israel. Of the 4 senatorial candidates vying for the Democratic nomination for California Senator, only Barbara Lee has called for a ceasefire. Interestingly, no Senate candidate got 60% of the vote, but Barbara Lee actually received the most votes. Now, I think there's a bit of a parallel here to other shows that we've done on labor unions, on this issue of Israel-Palestine, where we're seeing an age divide between younger and older Democrats around these issues of the Israel-Palestine or Gaza war and even transgender rights, I believe. I wonder if any of you would like to comment on this. I'm just going to kind of open it because I'm not sure who would. But any thoughts from any of you?
I'll say something. This is maybe. You know what? I think that it actually was completely called for. And I think that civil disobedience, protesting has historically been used here to bring to light issues that have been particularly shadow banned. And, I'm actually the only major candidate in my race calling for a ceasefire. And I can't believe that this is controversial to call for peace and to call for the stopping of the bombing of thousands and thousands of Palestinians, many of which are children. I have condemned the attacks on October 7th. I have condemned the hostage taking, but the response from Israel is completely disproportionate. And we here in the U.S. need to take a stand because we are funding Israel's military. We spend almost $1 trillion a year on the Pentagon. A lot of that money goes around the world. And unfortunately, I can't stand behind our tax dollars supporting a genocide in Palestine.
Any other comments from Aaron Reed? Yeah, go ahead.
This is Kristen, and a long time ago in my reporting career, I was actually based in the Middle East.
But this is Kristen, not Aaron, right? This is Kristen.
Yeah, it's Kristen.
Yeah, okay. Go ahead.
I was based first in Jerusalem, then in Beirut. And the problem here, it's understandable, and I don't object to the protests at all. But this is not a black or white situation where one side is right or one side is wrong. And it's nobody wants to see children get hurt or killed, obviously. And that's where I think the debate has gotten totally lost. Israel didn't start this. The problem is that what their tactics certainly aren't going to end it. And ending it is a goal. But the one-sided rhetoric that I'm hearing from some of the people in the Democratic Party, but from younger Democrats in particular, I think doesn't recognize where this came from. And it's, at the same time, it's absolutely possible and I think proper to be upset about the killing of civilians and also upset about what happened with Hamas's attack on Israel. And it's possible at the same time to be recognizing that the Israelis' tactics of oppressing Gaza and the Palestinians haven't helped to bring about peace. It's been a failed policy for decades. Yeah. I was last based in the Middle East in the 1980s.
Yeah.
And it hasn't changed.
Yeah, and I don't want, this could be a whole hour in a different show.
Yeah.
We could totally get into it because you used to be a correspondent for CBS and an Emmy Award-winning journalist, which is amazing. And so let's, Aaron, if you want to comment when we bring you back on for an answer, I just want to first say, as I was thinking about the three of you during the break, I just want to say that to have you on during Trans Day of Remembrance, and particularly resilience, at a time when many of us who are watching the news in red states in particular, but then also we're seeing these incursions in blue states, it feels very dark. It feels like if, Trump were to win the next election, we would all be kind of in fear for our lives. This is the situation that we find ourselves in now. And I just want to share from my heart how much hope the three of you, Aaron in the Morning, Aaron Reed of the Aaron in the Morning Substack, Maybe a Girl running for Congress, and also Kristen B, who reports on child sexual abuse and who's actually doing it and who's actually not, right? You bring me hope. And I just wanted to have a chance to say that to you all, because seeing trans people unafraid to get out on social media, to have these huge followings, to know that you're in the public eye, and to continue to speak out fearlessly, courageously. I guess one of my questions for you, and I'll start with Aaron, has it ever been scary for you? I know that, your partner got kicked out of being in the legislative chambers for calling out, the dangers to trans youth from the kinds of legislation they were passing. Do you ever feel scared, and how do you fight that yourself?
Well, of course, I don't think I know a single person who is active around LGBTQ topics, especially trans topics, be they an activist, a journalist, a sportscaster, anybody who has not gotten abuse, violent threats, hate mail. I had a SWAT team called in my house. This happens. And yes, there is fear. There's fear of what they can do to you and the lengths that people will go to target you. But I want to also say that LGBTQ people, we inherit a long tradition of people doing the right thing regardless of that fear. And we can go back to the 1930s in Weimar, Germany. We can go back to Pride and Stonewall. And we can go back to the AIDS epidemic where we had ACT UP people standing in the streets and standing in the legislatures. We've always been faced with this. And I don't think that I'm going to be the first one to let that stop me.
Mm-hmm. And do you notice also a generational divide, in the way we were talking about Israel, Gaza, Palestine, and also we've noticed with labor unions too. There are a lot of young people organizing in labor unions now, and we've covered that on the show. Do you notice that about LGBTQ plus issues or trans issues, Aaron, also?
I think, whenever it comes to generational divides, very clearly, younger generations, Millennial and Gen Z, tend to be extremely open about gender identity, and not just gender identity, about all LGBTQ identities. And, there is widespread support among younger people for liberation for LGBTQ people and for trans people to not be targeted by all of these laws. But I also do see that, yes, with unions, with Israel, Palestine, this is something that we are struggling with as a country. And I think that, I do have hope looking at the future generation and what they're experiencing. Whenever I was reporting on this stuff, I got a message from a girl who grew up in Louisiana, which is where I grew up. And she said, "Hey, Aaron, I love your work. And I just needed to let you know that I'm 17 years old, I'm a trans girl, and I was nominated to the homecoming court." And I cried because I'm from Louisiana. 20 years ago, I was bullied for being trans. Yeah. And now there's this young girl who is celebrated by her peers. I saw pictures of her dad driving her around the football stadium waving. That's how we have hope. That's how things change.
Yeah, and I've got statistics from the Pew Research Center that 72% of Democrats younger than the age of 30 actually believe that everyone should just be free to be who they are. What a concept, right? And how about you? Maybe do you notice a generational divide? Are you feeling supported actually in your campaign? How is it feeling to you? I know that there were these incidents with Proud Boys and et cetera at the schools in LA of all places, Glendale of all places. How are you feeling about do you feel afraid sometimes, or do you feel very supported? Tell me about your
Thanks for that question.
Yeah.
I certainly do feel supported by many people, but also I do, have some fear about, some person finding out that there's a trans person who also is a drag queen running for Congress. And it scares me about what somebody might consider doing. I've received a lot of hate mail. I've received a lot of terrible messages. But I've also received an incredible amount of support, not just here in LA or in California, but we actually now have almost 3,000 donors in all 50 states. And that was really a milestone when we realized that we have supporters in all 50 states. Because again, we often try to reduce states to being red states or blue states. When the fact of the matter is there are queer people everywhere. And I think that also kind of takes us back to what's happening in Gaza right now. One of the arguments that I really don't like seeing is, well, why don't you go to Gaza and see how they treat you there? And the fact of the matter is that there are queer people in Gaza. There's queer people everywhere. So the liberation of Palestinian people is also queer liberation. And, I also say this as a Jewish person, because there has been a huge spike in anti-Semitism. There's been a huge spike in Islamophobia. And there's also been a huge spike in anti-queer rhetoric, in transphobia. And I think that, when we have these laws that are being introduced here in the US, it really emboldens people who are transphobic. And unfortunately, I think the situation that's happening right now in Gaza has really emboldened folks who are anti-Semitic and folks who are Islamophobic. So there is a lot of intersections to be, analyzed in this situation. But I'm very, very lucky and very fortunate to feel that I mostly live in a safe place, in a safe space. And I know that a lot of people are on our side. And as I mentioned earlier, when we were talking about these disruptions at school board meetings, again, it is a very small but very vocal crowd of people who are doing anything they can to get attention. And I think the overwhelming majority of people actually do support queer people, do support trans people. And that's something that I'm hopeful about.
Yeah. Yeah, and actually, it sort of brings me back to this question that I was going to ask a little bit earlier, but we jumped into Israel, Gaza. And that is, of course, there are parents who don't understand what being transgender is. There are parents who are Christians who maybe other religions as well, who are fundamentalists, who are very conservative, who have been taught that being gay, being trans, being non-binary, being anything but, a man or a woman and straight, right, and cis is not okay. So there's that. But I feel like there are other forces at play. There's when you have fascism rising, you have scapegoating that happens, right? And so I'm wondering what your interpretations are of the motivations behind the Republican Party and conservatives at this time for making this attack on trans people and LGBTQ plus people. Erin, how about you? And then we'll go to Kristen.
Yeah, so this is a question that I think I get asked a lot.
Yeah.
And the one thing that I will say before I even get to motivations and stuff is that, we can't put ourselves in the heads of the people who pass these laws and who target us, but we can observe the impact of those laws. We can also look at the history. Again, I mentioned earlier that we inherit a rich history, and it's true that this has been a through line in American history and even world history for a very long time. The targeting of LGBTQ people back in the 1930s, back in the 50s and the 80s, it seems like every 20 years, there's this new panic over LGBTQ people. And right now, yes, it's centered on trans people, but I want to basically state that this is a fundamental issue. This is something that certain groups of people easily get riled up over queer people. And yes, part of that is religion, part of that is fascism, part of that is political posturing, and part of it is just the inherent distrust of what is different. But I think that our differences are what gives us strength as a society. And we trans people have just as much to contribute as anybody else.
Yeah, and then also here you are. I mean, it's like no one can change that fact. So rather than fight it like people are, why not celebrate? Why not accept? Why not be loving? Kristen Browde, attorney in Florida, a huge TikTok channel, Kristen B on TikTok, who reports on child sexual abuse, Emmy Award-winning journalist. Her bio goes on and on. What do you think are the motivations, or what are the agendas behind this anti-LGBTQ plus legislation we're seeing?
Well, the first thing I want to say about it is that I will not give them the credit of calling them conservatives. They are not conservative. Conservative implies preserving something. These are regressives. They want to bring us back to Puritan times. That's their interpretation of their religion. And I view it as largely a religious jihad of their own, and a very unfortunate one. This nation was founded on the idea that you could be who you want, worship who you want. These are people who, on one hand, are religious fanatics who want to impose their religious view on others. The others are, frankly, if you think back, I mean, my parents, my dad on my dad's side, were refugees from Hitler in Germany, and this is the very same rhetoric that Hitler used to scapegoat the Jews when he started out in Germany. And it's, you want somebody to make the enemy, and if you can make them the enemy, then you're seen as making advances for yourself. And that's how I think some of these right-wing regressives are actually posturing it and positioning it, because if they can get everybody riled up about us, well, look at that. You know, they've got followers. And it's cynical politics. It's disgusting politics. And we've seen it before, and it's dangerous.
Yeah, it feels like the politics of fear and anger. I mean, people have said it many times, you know, the politics of outrage. Trump is now using exactly Hitler's words in his speeches, talking about vermin and, cleansing the nation of quote unquote vermin, which is basically like, the American people, or most of us at any rate. Kristen, how about you in Florida as you're reporting on child sexual abuse and issues for LGBTQ plus people? Does it feel scary? I mean, I used to live in Coral Gables, actually, and I used to hang out in Coconut Grove and all over Miami. Is it feeling like it looks scary from the outside, but how does it feel?
Well, I moved here a year ago, August, because I lived in New York where it was safe, where we had done the work and gotten the laws passed through the help of really good group of politicians. We'd done the work. And I thought, look, at my age, what are they going to do to me, right? Where can I do some good? So that's why I came down here. So is it uncomfortable a lot of the time? Yeah. But that's what it's going to take. So if I'm a little uncomfortable from my admittedly extremely privileged position, I can only imagine, and I see, frankly, I don't have to imagine it, I see what those who have lived here their whole lives go through. Those who are being born and are coming out or want to come out now are going through. And that just makes me want to fight harder because, I don't know how much time I have left. We don't come with expiration dates.
Right.
But, let's see if we can't make it better.
Yeah. And, and the stakes are high because in my research and my understanding, learning about trans issues is when children and young people do not get support for how they feel about who they are. There's a risk of suicide beyond all the bullying and outside possible violence that can happen to them and harassment, making their lives miserable. So this is a very serious and real issue, especially for young people who don't often have a lot of support and guidance or support networks. And I'm going to ask you three a question, and you'll each get about 1 minute to answer, and then we're at the top of our show. The top of the hour, we're going to have to end our show. But I have this question for you, which is, okay, we might want to wave our magic wands and see, an egalitarian, pluralistic society, but we are in a moment where perhaps we need to get busy, each of us, right, to make that happen. So if you were to wave your magic wand and say, this is what I think people could do to help, this is what I would love to see across the United States in terms of what would be most effective for turning the tide on this issue, what would that be? I'm going to start with maybe.
Thank you. So that's a great question. I think that, first of all, you hear a lot of talk about folks being allies. Now is the time that we need our allies to stand up and speak up for us. It's sometimes not just enough to, post something on social media. I want you to be calling your local politicians, especially if you live in states that are, reviewing and about to vote on legislation that directly impacts queer and trans people. Contact your representatives, speak up, speak out, go to these meetings. I just want to see more solidarity with trans people. And I know that a lot of folks know that they care about trans people and they don't quite know what to do, but it is a civic duty to actually go and stand up when you feel as if there is injustice, not just for yourself, but other community members. There's that saying that none of us free are free until all of us are free.
Yeah, absolutely.
And now is really the time to stand up.
Thank you. Okay, let's go to Aaron Reed of the Aaron in the Morning Substack, huge TikTok creator as well, and partner of Zoe Zephyr in the Montana legislature. Aaron, what would you like to see people do en masse across the United States?
It's interesting because my answer to this is almost the opposite of en masse across the United States. My answer to this is act local. Locally is where we can change things. Locally is how we have gotten through the hardest time periods as a community. And in fact, I'm already seeing the beginning of that. Go to your school board races, go to your school board hearings. Those are so important. And you can stand up for your queer and trans kids in your community. If you support your local LGBTQ groups, they will know the battles that need to be had. They'll know where to send you. But it's so important, especially now more than ever, that we build strong local communities like we have in the past to organize around these issues.
So work local en masse.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And Kristen Browde, attorney in Miami, Florida, who reports on LGBTQ plus legislation and also child sexual abuse numbers, mostly actually in churches and religions. Kristen, what would your vision be for how you think people could most help at this time?
I think Zoe's exactly on the right point. They have to show up in mass in local races. They have to vote every time, every race, not just at the top of the ticket. Go all the way down to the judges. Find out what those judges are about and vote every single time. Get involved with your organizations, your political organizations, at the local level, because that's where the action is. That's where these people are coming from. You want to stop Moms for Liberty, you got to go where they live, which is at the school boards and town boards, and take them out.
Thank you so much, Kristen Browde. Kristen Browde is at Kristen B, Kristenb on TikTok. Kristen, do you have a website?
I do. Well, obviously, my law firm has browdelaw.com, but for the sex abuse statistics, it's whoismakingnews.com.
Whoismakingnews.com. Also, Erin Reed of the Erin in the Morning Substack. Her website is Erin Reed Writes. I'm sorry. Yeah, is that right? Her website is...
No, erininthemorning.com. Erin Reed Writes is my professional website for people to contact me.
Okay, so go to erininthemorning.com. And then we also have Maybe a Girl, who is running for Congress, running for Adam Schiff's seat. And that website is maybeagirlforcongress.com. MAEBEA girl for spelled out Congress.com. I want to thank you all for joining me on Moment of Truth.
.org.
Oh, I'm so sorry. .org. Maybeforcongress.org. Thank you all so much for joining me this evening.
Thanks, Amy.
Our next Moment of Truth live broadcast is Monday, December 4th, with the rock star climate journalist and award-winning podcast diva Amy Westervelt of the podcast Drilled, Rigged, and the Critical Frequency Podcast Network. Please contact the Moment of Truth team at amyami@ksqd.org with questions or comments about our program. Amy's coaching and education website is at www.amychen.com. Moment of Truth gives many, many thanks to our team, Nyanko Nyasu, sound and tech engineer, and our research and production team, Nyanko, Mei-Ling Obinata, Todd Zimmerman, and Vara Ramakrishnan. Todd Zimmerman of Nativeverse Studios created the theme song. Kathy Krizik created our logo. Thanks to our KSQD program manager, Howard Feldstein, and the entire KSQD team on the California Central Coast, where the show originates. Thank you for tuning in to Moment of Truth. And remember, if we don't use our democracy, we lose our democracy.